Welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Braxton Hunter, and along with me is
Jonathan
always
Pritchett.
riding alongside shotgun is Jonathan Pritchett. I won't say that he's the Robin to my Batman, the short round to my Henry Jones Jr., but he is here with me today, and as well, we have Dr. Leighton Flowers. Dr. Flowers, welcome to the show.
Hey, my honor to be here, guys. Always like hanging out, talking with Jonathan and Braxton about theology and life. It's always fun.
Yeah. And we've got your favorite subject today, Calvinism. And I picked this.
He rarely talks about it.
Yeah, rarely. Well, I mean, on this channel, he's 50-50 for Calvinism and other stuff. We're going to talk about Calvinism, but not really theology, because we're interested in culture, broader evangelical culture, and Calvinism for the last 25...
Hold on. First, let me say, because I can tell that you're really doing like a really well formal, thought out.
I was, and then you...
Okay, but
yeah.
I want to ruin that.
Yeah.
And I want to, before you're going to get to do it again, so that was like a dress rehearsal. And I want to say, let us know how our mics sound. Now, don't get nitty about it, but if it's actually uncomfortable, like if it's a big division, like difference, then let me know. Pritchett, I think you were going to kind of give a preamble here.
Yeah, and I would say for the last 25 years or so, Calvinism has had an impact for good and bad in the broader evangelical culture here, at least here in the United States, and I'm sure abroad. And I wanted to talk about both the good and the bad. And I know that even though nobody believes this, nobody believes that Leighton and I used to be Calvinists. If you're a Calvinist, you don't believe that, which is fine.
Thanks, Casey.
I don't care. But as far as my background goes, I grew up Methodist, and then that became intolerably liberal because they swap these pastors around every 7 to 10 years or so. And we happened to get a crazy one. This was even back in the 80s. So the Methodists, what you're seeing them imploding, goes a long way back. But so we went to the Bible Church Little Rock, and at the time, the pastor of that church was Dr. Steve Lawson, who I'm sure many of you have heard of before. And so he was my pastor in my formative teenage years. And then he eventually left that church to go to Dauphin Way, where
I preached there.
Yeah, where he shrunk it down to almost shadow of its former glory, and then moved down the street. So we'll talk about some of the ugly parts about that. And then, Leighton, what's your background with Calvinism? Because people know that you used to be one, because everyone talks about how you're obviously liar, or you never really was, the no true Scotsman. But refresh our audience for your background.
I'll tell the story. Basically, Leighton was a Calvinist, but he noticed that he was constantly being bullied by Calvinists, and they hurt his feelings all the time.
That's it.
There's I think if you were to go to a therapist where they did some of that repressed memory type stuff, we would find out that some Calvinists really hurt him.
So even though he's like 6'9" and was a former football player, a bunch of stubby bearded Calvinists were really mean to him. The cosplay lumberjack Calvinists were super mean.
Yeah, that's no. What happened, Leighton?
Yeah, I was raised in a typical Southern Baptist church, and so I think a lot of the Calvinists that critique me, especially in the Reformed Baptist tradition or the hardline, Presbyterian type Reformed Calvinists, they're probably accurate to say I wasn't like them. I was more of a Southern Baptist type of Calvinist, J.D. Greer kind of a guy. It wasn't. It was something that I believed. I taught. I believed tulip, for the basic concept of tulip, but I didn't like calling myself a Calvinist because of the misconceptions of Calvinism when I became one, at the age of 19. But I was a big John Piper fan, MacArthur fan, Sproul fan, got all the Ligonier tapes in the mail and all that kind of stuff. And I converted a lot of people while I was a college minister there at University Baptist in Abilene. I converted a lot of the students that came through my program into Calvinism, some of which are still Calvinists today. Matt Chandler was one of the ones that taught over at university at the ministry called Grace. And I helped to convert him into believing limited atonement. And so he was a year younger than me.
Well, I think
so
God used you as a means to convert him.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's what I meant. And so, that was pretty much in my 20s, all the way from age 19 to about 29, 30. I was a card-carrying Calvinist in that sense. Went to the Founders Ministry conferences with my pastor and the other Calvinist, ministers in the church that I was a part of that had split off of our home church there in Wiley. It's still there, Cornerstone Baptist Church there in Wiley, Texas. It still exists. I was a minister in that church, and we went to the Founders Ministry of the Southern Baptist Convention conferences, and that was my group. Those were my peeps, so to speak. That was my clan, my people. And so even today, there are different kinds of Calvinists out there. A lot of Calvinists that are in the Presbyterian or Reformed Baptist kind of groups don't really like the Founders all that much, or don't agree with some of the Founders Ministry materials either. And so some of those guys are not going to ever see me as one of them, because I never was really one of them, and that's fine. That doesn't really bother me when people don't think that I was a true Calvinist or truly Reformed in the same way they were, because they may be right to some level. The point is that I affirmed the concepts of predestination from a Calvinistic perspective. I interpreted tulip in the Calvinistic way that tulip is usually explained and expounded upon, and I converted a lot of people to believe that way, using a lot of the same very popular arguments that are used by Calvinists today. And so that's just kind of the fact of the matter of what happened in my own journey.
So what's more embarrassing?
Let me say something real quick. Is first of all, I wanted to just mention that we are going to talk about, as the title suggests, the good and the bad of Calvinist culture in the church. And just want to make the typical disclaimer that Pritchett doesn't want me to have to make, that we're not just the channel that loves atheists, we're also the channel that loves Calvinists. And we have Calvinist students, we have had Calvinist professors, we have a Calvinist professor, we have, and we love our Calvinist brothers and sisters. They're still our brothers and sisters, all things being equal. Just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, Calvin, the only Calvinists I don't like are the ones that, like, if I post something about, hey, let's be sure and eat healthy this week, and they're like, this always these trolls on Twitter is like, are you just going to use your free will to what?
Yes, I am actually.
Well, yeah, but I mean, they're just always, are you going to worship your God of free will to help you make better choose to eat better? It's like, I don't even know why they're like that. That's part of the bad. We'll get to the bad later. But first, I wanted to ask Leighton, what's more embarrassing, that you were a Southern Baptist Calvinist, which means you were kind of, I don't know, kind of a wishy-washy Calvinist, or the fact that I was a Calvispensationalist in the John MacArthur, Steve Lawson tradition, where we were both, I mean, that's fake Calvinism. I mean, at least the Presbyterians have it right with covenantal theology, but I was a full-blown dispensational Calvinist, like, with a straight face. That's what they are. And so what do you think is more embarrassing? Is a dispensational Calvinist or a Southern Baptist?
A John MacArthur Calvinist, or what? A Southern Baptist Calvinist?
Or I don't know what I am Calvinist. I like the tulip thing. That kind of that's well, the SBC.
I mean, there's probably a lot of similarities and crossover between those two, because a lot of my peeps, the people in that group, really love John MacArthur. And there are a lot of dispensationalists within the Baptist world too. I know DTS here in Dallas is big dispensationalist type of church and leans Calvinistically. But a lot of times you don't see dispensationalism crossing over with Calvinism as much. And so that's where MacArthur was a little bit of a strange, breed. And he wasn't near as Calvinistic as he is now in, the 70s and 80s when you go back and listen to his sermons. In fact, I've played several sermons on my broadcast where he teaches provisionism, as far as I can tell, and makes a case for our point of view with regard to God's provision. And that's true of even, Piper and other, well-known Calvinists today. You go back and listen to their sermons when they were, quote unquote, less known for their Calvinism. There's a lot of sermons and things, Tim Keller especially, about, most of his messages all throughout his life sounded very provisionistic or non-Calvinistic. And so sometimes it's kind of hard to tell unless you know what to look for.
Well, I think in the 80s and 90s.
Hey, Edward, thanks for being our Calvinist student.
We love
You're
Edward.
not alone.
A true apologist right there. in the 80s and 90s, I do think with MacArthur and the dispensationalism and stuff, see, we're all old. And a lot of the people that watch our program probably aren't as old as we are. We're really, really old people. And so I'm old enough to remember like prior to and the build up to the Left Behind series. And so back then, dispensationalism was huge. It's not the case now, but dispensationalism, I think, was a great hook to get people into Calvinist theology for the MacArthurites. And the fact that his Grace to You program was on the radio is this thing that, most people, I guess they Bluetooth their phones for audio now, but we had these things called radios, and they had radio stations, and Christians would broadcast their program on it. And so with all of that, I think that was a pretty big hook in the 80s and 90s. But then after the Left Behind fatigue, you started to see the rise of the Calvinist online conference culture, publishing. I call it the publishing glut of Calvinist books. Like all of a sudden, I want to say by the mid 2000s, like every other book being published from evangelical publishers was a Calvinist book, and why Calvinism is super awesome, and why you should be a Calvinism, and Arminianism sucks, and all of these books that came out. Those aren't the actual. Well, they might be some actual titles, given how many there were. But
So
that was the general gist of it. And then these conferences, like it used to be in the olden days, like your dad's time, when your dad would have a prophecy conference at his big old church. I mean, hundreds and thousands of people show up for the prophecy. But then it became the Calvinist, and you had like Hooray for Calvinism, and we're all together for Calvinism, and Calvinism is the gospel, coalition Calvinism. And all of these little organizations started having these conferences that just attracted thousands of people to them. And, they were willing to pay.
Are you trying to set up the show by talking about this created a culture?
Yeah.
I'm trying to get us on
and
track.
the shift of the culture and why Calvinism, I think, has been on the steady progression. I think it kicked off with John MacArthur, really, and then it progressed into this like Together for the Gospel and Gospel Coalition and all that stuff, and then there was you can remember back in 10, 12 years ago, the online heated debates and all of that was going on, and you had the cage stage Calvinist phenomenon going on, you had the Mark Driscoll thing, and there was just so much going on, and then in latter years, all of that has seemingly collapsed, and it's imploding on itself, and all these Calvinist factions are fighting. So that's just kind of to give a broad overview.
So you've got different types of Calvinists,
Yeah.
whether that is true of their specific beliefs, which it could be, at least with social things for sure, as we're going to move forward. But
social and political.
And political, but you have these different types of Calvinists, and sometimes you have different doctrinal positions, obviously. And so let's get into it.
Yeah,
so
Calvinism, the doctrine of the tulip brought Sproul and MacArthur together, and Presbyterian, and for all intents and purposes, MacArthur was a Baptist, and they were all they all had the Together for the Gospel because they thought Calvinism is basically, to quote Spurgeon, the gospel, and so they had their big club that differences of opinions on all kinds of things, but Calvinism and complementarianism was the things that they kind of rallied behind during those, the mid to late, aughts or whatever. But going back for me, here are some good things that I can say for Calvinists. Okay.
Are we going to talk about the specific people that are on the thumbnail? Or,
well, we'll get to that.
Okay.
But just to butter up our audience, there are, believe it or not, I have wonderful things to say about Calvinism.
Let's do it.
The first thing is I was a member of two Calvinist churches. One was the Bible Church of Little Rock, where Steve Lawson was pastor, and the other was Remount Baptist Church in North Little Rock, where my friend John Winters was pastor. And at both of those churches, and then several of the ones that I visited, one of the things that I love about Calvinist churches is they take theological education very, very seriously, and you don't find that as much in non-Reformed churches, because they are all about their confession, whether it's the 1689 or the Westminster or whatever. They're all about having big, robust church libraries. They're all about indoctrinating
And
you
publishing.
and catechizing you. Yeah, I mean they're serious
So
about.
you want to get Leighton's
theological
take on
education.
all this?
Huh?
You want to get Leighton's take on this?
Yeah. So was that your yeah? Do you have any? Do you have any sort of?
Even just recently, I saw on Twitter a guy with a big long beard, of course, and he had a shirt on that says, "I was a Calvinist before it was cool." And that kind of captures what you're talking about, because I remember back in the 80s, 90s, before Calvinism was cool, because when I became a Calvinist, it wasn't cool to be a Calvinist. You were kind of a stealth Calvinist if you were one, because people saw it as a lot more cultic, and it was, not popular at all. And so you kind of kept it to yourself, and you stayed within your little groups. And so what happens whenever a particular way of thinking, a particular group comes into power, so to speak, where they become the driving force of the largest Protestant denomination in the world, like they did with Southern Baptist, they become a lot more outspoken. They become a lot more, putting out publications, prolific in all their writings and all their things, and everybody wants to be like them. And so you have all of this kind of cult-like following. And I'm not using cult in the most negative sense there. I mean, any group can have a cult-like following in the sense that you have a fanboys, that just love everything that that person is putting out, and they buy their T-shirts and buy their books, and that happened all during our coming of age in the theological world. And so that's the cultural shift I think you really saw happening, and it's just now I think that we're seeing in the last 10 years or so, once the Calvinists have stopped kind of fighting with the non-Calvinists because they've won for the most part with regard to who's in charge, now they can turn their sights onto each other about whatever differences they have with themselves within themselves. And I think that's what you start seeing now in this environment, is a lot of the Calvinists begin to pick each other apart with regard to the differences of opinions that they have with, the woke, movement. And, you already mentioned, complementarianism versus egalitarianism. That's becoming a bigger issue. The Black Lives Matter, controversies and all those things that are happening in our culture now. Now Calvinists are taking sides. Both of them affirm Calvinism, but they're approaching those cultural issues in different ways. And now you see those divisions begin even among the Calvinists, and that creates different cultures.
Yeah, so, I labeled them about 4 years ago. You could find posts where I started breaking them into categories. I call them the Oldvinists, which is the old Calvinists, like the suit and tie Calvinists, and then you had the Wokevinists, which you know who called this, by the way? You remember J.D. Hall? He's probably written about 75 articles about you before he went away or whatever. But he called this a long time ago.
Most of them false. Most of them false, by the way.
Absolutely. But one of the things I'll give him credit for is he saw all this Calvinism implosion and infighting coming, because he pointed to Al Mohler, and I think he was probably right about that, because Al Mohler kind of sat in the middle of the Oldvinists, the button-down Calvinists, and the new Wokevinists that we're all teaching at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. I think some of them have since moved on. But, he platformed a lot of the people that people on, say, the more conservative, old-school Calvinists are now decrying all over Twitter, and they all hate each other. And I don't think Schadenfreude is a good thing, but it's something. It's kind of like one of those things. It's like, told you.
So let me jump in here. So as I am trying to connect with what you brought as a topic today, Jonathan, and I'm thinking about the churches that I've been in, and you asked me, have I been in Calvinist churches? And I have. And what I find is I've not been in probably the what you're describing as the woke Calvinist churches, but I've been in churches with a guy who identifies as a Calvinist. Let's say this has been a lot of the churches, and he would say he's a Calvinist probably because it was a Southern Baptist church or something, and so it was common in decades past to say, well, yeah, of course I'm a Calvinist. I believe in eternal security or something, and so they might say they're a Calvinist, and they might use a lot of the language that the Calvinist commentaries will use, but then if you ask them if they believe in free will in the sense, and then describe it to them as libertarian free will, well, yeah, of course. So they're kind of like a inconsistent Calvinist, as we would say.
And they have the contemporary worship and all.
And they have their actual what happens practically is no different than a non-Calvinist.
Yeah, see, that's the middle group. That's what I call the hipvinists.
Okay, that's the hipvinist.
They're
But
the
they're not
hipster-
always hip. Sometimes they're just old guys.
Well, but they don't tuck it. They're like our preacher who still doesn't tuck his shirt in, probably. So
Okay,
even though
there's
they
some like that,
should,
but
right.
I'm telling you, I think there's some guys that have come out of seminary, or maybe they didn't go to seminary, and they will say, "No, I'm a Calvinist," but they have the clip-on tie and the short
Like
button-up
Paul
sleeve.
Cooper was a hipvinist until he
was a hipvinist.
was convinced
but-
by Leighton and not you to leave Calvinism.
You know, I hoped that would just flutter by. But anyway, so I've had those kind, and then I've seen the kinds of churches where, and I'll kick it back to you in a second, Leighton, because we need to let you talk. But I've also been in the churches where same deal, but they are very serious about the fact that they're Calvinists and they know what it means and they've studied this out. And in those churches, maybe it will probably affect practically how they handle certain aspects of church life. For example, they may not have altar calls, or they may have a very different type of looking invitation. They will be more closed off to things that we would call charismatic than even a typical Southern Baptist might be. You know, those kind of things. But more or less, you're still going to have a fine, experience there. It's going to be very much like whatever denomination it's in. Then you have, on the other hand of this, on the other side of this thing, you're saying, okay, we have the woke ones, but now there's another type of person here. And so maybe there's more, because this type of person I'm going to describe is a person who comes into a church, and this is not necessarily logically connected to their Calvinism, but they will be oftentimes some of these people can be very controlling of aspects of the church that other pastors might not even get too interested in. They might make sure that, I have one example, and it's just anecdotal. A pastor might decide that if you are not able to be here every Sunday, then you can't be involved in anything related to the service of the church, like taking up the offering or a greeter or anything like that. And I've seen stuff like that lead to the church getting smaller. And, sometimes it needs to. But I think there is a hard-nosed Calvinist, and then there are these guys that don't, they know what they're talking about, but it doesn't affect much. It'll affect a little bit, but not much. And then you have the guys that call themselves Calvinists and they're not really Calvinists. So, and then you have the woke.
Well, and there's the categories like this on the non-Calvinist side too. You get more the fundamentalists, hardliners with real strict rules, and then the more moderate kind of guys that are a little bit more free with the drinking of alcohol or smoking or something like that. You have different groups of people. And there's some groups that I get along better than with others. I mean, whether they're Calvinist or not, just because maybe of where I've kind of landed over the course of my own journey. Cause I was a pretty hardline kind of a Calvinist, a very complementarian kind of fundamentalist type of guy in my early years. And I have really backed away from that in a lot of ways because of not just leaving Calvinism. It was really more of just experiencing grace. Those who are forgiven much tend to love much and tend to be a little bit more forgiving and gracious towards those who have differing views on secondary matters. At least that's been my experience. And I'm not trying to say anybody who has a hardline view on a particular thing is not forgiving or hasn't been graced by God. But it just seems to me that the people that I tend to get along with, you have Joe Thorne, for example, on your thumbnail there. He and I had some disagreements back and forth, and we did dueling, videos over the years. But Joe and I have always gotten along really well. And even though Joe, has some views that other Calvinists would look down upon, maybe because he, all the tattoos and the long beards and the smoking, those kinds of things. He's also just a really nice guy, and he treats me with respect, even though we disagree with each other. And so someone like Joe, he and I think probably if he lived here locally, he would probably be one of my friends that I'd hang out with, because he reminds me a lot of my friend Jason, who's Calvinistic leaning and has tattoos and smokes and drinks and all that kind of fun stuff. And he's the kind of guy that is a fun guy to hang out with. And he doesn't judge me, and he doesn't look down upon me because I don't believe the same way that he does. We argue with each other about it, but we love each other and would do anything for each other. And I think Joe would be that kind of friend to me if I lived in his neighborhood or if I was, at his church. And so that's the way that Joe strikes me in our casual conversations that we've had with each other. Others, I honestly, I'm not going to name names on this one, but I honestly think that if they found out that I did something that they don't approve of, that they would write me off immediately and damn me to hell.
Some of them already have written you off and damned you to hell, by the way.
Oh yeah. And I just don't have this life. I don't know. I'm about to turn 50. I'm 49, and this life is way too dang short to waste on that. I'm sorry. Yeah. That's just the way I felt about it.
Amen.
Before we get to the horrible things about Calvinism, because that's what our audience is really looking forward to. Aside from church education, I do want to say, now that you brought up like the Joe Thorne, he's what I put in the Hitvinist category. One of the great things that Calvinism has contributed to broader evangelicalism is that they really took the shift that started happening in the 90s, but they really got out of the fundamentalist funk. And decided it's to loosen up the tie a little bit, to really get rid of a lot of the legalism that I grew up with, even in Calvinist churches. They were more like, if you're going to have a beer, no big deal. If you're going to smoke a cigarette or a cigar or something, no big deal, whatever. You don't have to wear a suit to church and stuff. So they kind of kicked off a lot of the legalism that I remember growing up with. And I think that has overall been a blessing, because while some of what I call the Olvinists, if you're not John MacArthur, you have a problem of church shrinking. You've experienced some of this you've left a church, a Calvinist pastor came in and the church just dwindled to nothing. But you also have these Calvinist churches that will spring up, and within 2 years, they're running 600 to 1,000. Which is in church life, it's like overnight almost, compared to the churches down the street that are kind of bitter about it. So they were able to really do a lot of outreach. Now, I know that some of that people are going to push back that know better. They're going to say, well, some of that was they were attracting people that were Calvinists in non-Calvinist churches and kind of consolidating them into these larger churches. But even with that going on, there was still a lot of outreach and stuff. So I think the Hitvinists contributed a positive overall thing that had an impact to even non-Calvinist churches to let the hair down a little bit. And so I think that that's a good thing. But I do think Calvinists' impact on evangelicalism, and then what's going on right now, if Twitter is to be believed. And I stopped thinking Twitter was fake and not real life after the past 2 Southern Baptist conventions. Mm-hmm. Twitter is real life in the evangelical world. And so watching all what's going on now, I think a lot of that goes back to the cage stage thing. Because the cage stage thing, I remember 10, 12 years ago, we would just talk theology with people, and then we would get slammed with you're a Pelagian heretic.
Thanks, Mr. Green. That's awesome.
Thank you. And we would get just nasty. And so I would get nasty back. That became my thing. If you're going to get nasty with me, I'm going to get nasty with you. But there seems to be this underlying current in Calvinism to where if they are going to go after somebody, whether it's non-Calvinists or even their Calvinist opponents, they can get pretty nasty.
Yeah.
Are we talking about the bad stuff yet? Is that what
we're
okay?
Yeah. Well, I'll give one negative and one positive of the Calvinistic movement over the years that I've noticed. Let's do the positive first. They take theology seriously. They were a pendulum swing away from the real seeker-sensitive model of the Rick Warrens and Bill Hybels, where it says, who cares what the lost person thinks? What does God think? And there's some truth in that. And I think there's also some truth in us making appeals to the lost and making our churches where they don't drive away lost people. I think there's some good in what Rick Warren and Bill Hybels and that group taught us. So I'm not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater with that. But the pendulum swinging around that seeker-sensitive model from the Pipers and the Sprouls and the MacArthurs of the world, I think there are some positive aspects of let's focus on exegesis. Let's focus on Scripture as being our authority instead of pragmatic, seeker-sensitive growth strategies to make our church look as much like the world as possible. I think they had some strong points there. And because of that, they really highlighted theology and the glory of God and understanding the bigness of God and how important we need to treat this as not just, we need to treat Christianity as if it is the most important thing, because it is. And most Calvinists that I know, because of that, take theology real seriously. And they really, they study their Bibles and they really want to know more and they want to drive down deep. And I like that about most of my Calvinist friends. It's one of the reasons a lot of times if I'm hanging out with people, sometimes I'd rather hang out with Calvinist guys because at least they know something about what they're talking about. Whereas most of the non-Calvinist, whatever nebulous group that may be out there, a lot of them haven't ever studied this stuff and they're just going, huh? You know, and they
right.
don't,
I would say,
I want to
say that they probably
go ahead.
helped in the sense that they made non-Calvinists become better at arguing their position back to, against Calvinists, because they were pretty lazy for a long time and their arguments have finally got better. Sorry, that's funny.
Yeah, I was just going to say a nuance point, not exactly the same point that you're making, is it occurs to me, and this is completely anecdotal, but again, and this is the only thing I'll say for myself, I speak as a fool, but it is from a guy who has spoken in hundreds of churches of various denominations. And I can tell you, it seems to me that non-Calvinists are more likely than Calvinists. Of course, when we say non-Calvinists, we're basically talking about the rest of Christianity. So that's a huge swath. Right. But but it seems to me that non-Calvinists are pastors and church people are more likely to be the type of Christian who will take their speculations more seriously than maybe they should in certain circumstances. And this goes back to the whole, no, we're going to what the Bible says. Every evangelical should say that, and every Southern Baptist will say that. But the truth is, do they mean it or not? Because I've seen a lot of reasoning that goes something like this. Well, you know, when I look at this passage, I think one thing that it could mean is this. And this one over here also could mean something kind of like that. And when I put those together, it would mean this. And so that's what I'm going to preach. And it's like, hold on, man. Right. You're letting your speculations run a little wild here. Whereas Calvinists often have more of a built-in sort of governor there to go, whoa. Where's the proof text for that? How do I defend that? And I appreciate that. Yeah.
Well, and you know, the flip side of the coin for the positive, the positive being all those things that we already said about them really highlighting, exegetical, preaching, going through the scriptures and highlighting the glory of God, all the positive sides of things. The negative side of that can be somewhat of a kind of feeling of superiority over those who are not like them. Or who don't think like them. And this is one of the reasons that when I came out of Calvinism, I really didn't want to tell anybody, because I remember how I, as a Calvinist, thought about everybody who wasn't a Calvinist. Because I had a general feeling about everyone who wasn't a Calvinist, this feeling of, well, they're theologically lazy. They're emotionally based. They're not serious thinkers. They're not in-depth exegetical types of Christians. That's what I thought of about all the non-Calvinists out there, because that's what I had experienced from all the non-Calvinists that I had encountered. And so it was only when I really began to study and get into this, discussion, that I began to be introduced to the robust teachers and the deep theological minds that the other side has to offer, because they weren't real popular like the Pipers of the world. And so I just didn't know they existed. And so I felt like a fish out of water, so to speak, when I came out of Calvinism, because I didn't have a place to belong. I didn't have a brotherhood of people I wanted to be identified with. I was ashamed of being a non-Calvinist, because non-Calvinists weren't representing themselves very well, at least in the public sphere. And so the negative side of that, I think it produces among the Calvinists, is this superiority complex. I had it too. I'm not preaching at Calvinists this way. As a matter of fact, other Calvinists like Piper and others have called out the cage stagers and other Calvinists who become like this, where they become kind of prideful. And the reason that happens, it's because when you're a Calvinist, and I had this happen several times, I'd go to professors who are longtime professors and bring up this topic, and I could literally run circles around them on this topic as a Calvinist, and they were a professor of theology. And I'm going, what how in the world do you not understand this? And I thought of Arminians are idiots. I mean, they're not real bright here. And that, what does that automatically do to you? I don't actually think I hold to a view that's just more superior than these other guys hold to, because none of them know how to defend it. None of them even, they seem surprised when I bring up this verse, like they've never really understood it. They want to run away from it. They use emotional appeals. They do all this other stuff.
But Leighton, one of the funniest things about that is when, and you experience whatever somebody's position is on any issue, when they have that sort of a vibe or they have that sort of an outlook that, oh my gosh, people that don't see this, they're just not seeing it. They just can't, they're missing something, and they haven't, those kind of people. The great thing is when somebody like you comes along and then does that and then challenges them in a way that they can't answer. And then they totally don't see it coming because they thought, well, this is completely defensible. This is so obvious. And
that's one of the reasons that the reaction towards me from many Calvinists is so vitriolic, because when you back somebody into a corner, what do? They strike out at you. They ad hominems, he's the tall gremlin. He's the one string banjo. This is all he ever talks about. He's obsessed. He does analogesis. All he does is tell stories and all these kinds of accusations. And we're going, what does any of that have to do with the theological point we just made?
I mean, is it possible told stories, but okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things you're going, okay, I tell too many stories. I was a youth pastor for 12 years. Sue me. Okay. I like to tell stories. I use parables to help explain my exegetical findings. But just because I use stories and analogies doesn't mean I didn't do exegesis to come to the conclusion that I came to. And so you have these kinds of just, people throwing smoke and throwing grenades into the middle of things, just, and saying, oh, Leighton's this or Leighton's that, without giving me a fair hearing, mostly hearing about me through my opponents versus actually giving me fair hearing. And what I'm doing to them is basically what they're used to doing to all the Arminians, non-Calvinists of the world out there. They're used to going in and just destroying the arguments from the Arminian, because the Arminian mostly doesn't know what he's talking about. Usually, I'm speaking generally of the non-Calvinist out there. Most of them don't have any clue as to what they believe about the doctrine of predestination. Well, the opposite is true. Most Calvinists have no idea what the actual scholars who know what they're talking about from our perspective think and believe. And it's really easy to get them backed into a corner theologically when you know what you're talking about and the Calvinist doesn't know the scholarly view of the other side. And listen, when I'm saying that, I'm not trying to be overly bombastic or mean about it. Even the best of the best scholars who debate this for a living, like James White, you can watch his broadcast and you can see him coming to understand our view for the very first time on the program, where he'll say things like, well, I don't think Leighton holds to that, does he? And he'll be like looking at Rich and like he's discovering it for the first time. This is a guy who spends his life debating people like us, and he still doesn't follow most of the arguments that I make on my program because he hasn't taken the time to really engage. Why? Because our view is superior. We already have it figured out. We're kind of this elite group up here, and we really don't need to bother ourselves with all those, silly little emotional Arminians out there who don't really know what they're talking about, who are just emotionally based and don't really, think about these things deeply like we do. And so they just surface level discussions that they're used to. They stay at that inch deep surface level discussion through their entire, and they're really good at beating people at that inch deep level. But they go below the inch deep, they have no meat. They have no arguments that are strong that I have found. And again, I know Calvinists would want to disagree with that, but that's been my experience with this whole discussion, is that very few Calvinists are willing to go beyond the surface level of this argument. And then once you do take them to that level, most of the time they'll turn personal or get angry.
I mean, my experience has been there's just, because I mean, you can go into my office and see a lot, probably half of it is Reformed literature, just simply because they,
the same.
I mean, not all of it dealing with Calvinism per se, but Calvinist authors and stuff. But having been steeped in it.
But Jonathan, you have this one in your bathroom. So
right, it's in the bathroom right next to the toilet paper, and I make the choice every time because I have free will. And so far I'm still choosing the toilet paper, but I mean,
When you
never
run out,
know
you
one
never
day.
know.
I mean, there was that time in 2020.
Okay,
But-
well, what about the woke Calvinism stuff?
Well, I was going to say, well, theologically, they all argue basically the same. Leighton's kind of right. And when I look through my library, it is that, and I see that there's one of the biggest things, and we've talked about it with Dr. Allen, we've talked about it with Dr. Harwood, we've talked about it with Dr. Flowers before, is there's a lot of self-referential
Incoherence.
No, self-referential citations.
Oh.
So they're citing that John Frame's the worst. He'll cite his own books like so many times in his other books, and then there's just a lot of citing of more Calvinists, right? And whether it's their scholarship or it's the conversation on Facebook or whatever, they just do not read that far outside of their own tradition.
Look at Derek's comment, Derek Bueller's comment there about James White's book, which we actually require people to read at Trinity. For my course, I want them to read both sides, so they'll read White's book and my book, and so we're trying to give a fair hearing. But Derek is making a valid point. I know Nick did a critique of the Potter's Freedom by James White. And this is true. It's held as the antidote to Arminianism, but he doesn't even quote the scholarly Arminians in order to combat them. He'll tell you what he thinks they mean, or he thinks they believe what they think they believe. 90% of the time, he gets it wrong, and then he attacks the straw man.
He referenced Geisler a few times in there, but I mean, a lot of times he didn't reference anything. There's not a lot of footnotes. But in that book, anyway, some of his other books have more documentation, but that book doesn't have much of anything in it, but they just don't read. And so when I have conversations with Calvinist interlocutors, which is less than I used to, but I mean, I don't still party like it's 2012 the way you do, Leighton. But it's when I talk to them, I still have a hard time discussing anything because I'm like, you're coming at this with 16th century categories as if you've read nothing about the ancient world. You've read no social science book about the world of the New Testament, let alone read any Greco-Roman literature, even translated. So I have a hard time even getting off the ground because when they start talking about grace, and I'm talking about grace, I'm talking about patron-client reciprocity, they're just scratching their heads like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, well, I mean, you could start with Seneca, who's a contemporary of Paul, writing Cone, but conversations that they just haven't read so much scholarship out there that it's even hard to get off the ground with a lot of them because I'm like, we agree on every verse in the Bible, what it says. Every verse you read to me, I agree with what it says. We differ on what it means. But there is like a world of difference between what we carry as far as our principles, our filters, our lenses, or whatever you want to say for hermeneutics and exegesis can sometimes be so worlds apart that it's hard to even have debates because they can't even follow with what you're saying because they don't even think in the same category. And the shift for me happened in the mid-2000s when I read David De Silva's book. And I've talked about that kind of kicked off that rabbit trail where I got into social science and rhetorical criticism. But for a lot of them, it's like they never even scratch the surface with some of that stuff. So it's really hard when I remember being a Calvinist and coming out of it, having my mind blown by that kind of stuff, because it's like I'd never had encountered any of this material, and let alone just like, I mean, I've heard as far as Arminianism goes, the Roger Olson case for Arminians, that kind of thing, but just the deeper exegetical toolkits that you had to put together to understand the New Testament on its own terms that you get with like a Witherington or a Keener or some of those guys. It's just like reading that material is just off the radar for Calvinists, and I think that they would do themselves well to start reading beyond their tradition.
Hey, real quick, I wanted to say, Christoph, man, thank you for that super chat, and it looks like you have also been a channel member for 2 years or more, and thank you for that. Christoph says, without Calvin's views on the sacraments and on ecclesiology, they're not Calvinists, but tulipists. James White isn't a Calvinist either.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I agree with John Calvin's book 4, chapter 17 on that, like with the Lord's Supper, dead on. And I'm not a Calvinist at all, but I agree with Calvin on things that are unrelated to soteriology that I think a lot of the Baptists wouldn't, as far as like a form of real presence in the Eucharist and some of the sacramental stuff. So yeah.
Well, we'll get to maybe the woke side of this in a minute, but let's get some questions real quick just to keep things moving and interesting. One that I didn't get that I wanted to ask was somebody asked, it may have been Neeland, why do you think there's so much disdain for Calvinists or for Calvinism, or I don't remember how he asked it, among people on our side of this thing? Leighton?
Well, some people who didn't ever become a Calvinist or were never part of the Calvinistic, groups or anything like that, only know about Calvinists from what they've seen online. And the online representation of any group is probably not the best, because you've got a lot of people who are, the quote unquote basement dwellers, who, or because they have the privacy of a screen and the anonymity of an avatar or whatever, they'll say some of the grossest and meanest things. And again, that's of all groups, not just the Calvinistic group. No group is very well represented by the online representation of whatever group it is. And so that's part of the problem, is that when people only know Calvinism from what they've experienced in the online chat world, they're going to have a really, really bad opinion versus the way I experienced Calvinists. The mentor who led me into Calvinism is one of the most kind, gentle-hearted, loving men that you could ever meet. His name is Steve Harden. He just texted me the other day, just some sweet words of advice for me, and I just love this man. And I don't know if he's still a Calvinist. He was when he was 30-something when he introduced me to Calvinism, but I don't even care. He's just one of those guys that has always been a huge influence on my life, and is always, I've just love this man. And Matt Chandler and others, great friends, people that I don't really care whether they're a Calvinist all that much, that, I get along with them just fine. And my whole world of my friends, Jason and others that I talked about, who are Calvinistic guys, we all get along really well, and they're friendly, and they're loving people, and they're gracious, and they're missionaries, and they're helping in the homeless, and they're doing all the same things that all the other Christians are doing in my community and around the world. And so I don't have all of these pent up negative feelings towards the heretic Calvinists that I want to go, yell down. And you, believe it or not, even though I'm railed on as the anti-Calvinist and you just hate Calvinist kind of a person, this is usually the accusation made by people who don't know me very well or haven't listened to me very long. The biggest comments I get in opposition to me are from people who are not Calvinists, who think I should be meaner to Calvinists, and I should call them heretics, and I should call them out. I mean, that is the biggest comments that I get, the most quantity of comments.
Some of the people, like in your soteriology, I know that you're not like running around policing your own Facebook group, but like a lot of the people in the Soteriology 101, we can talk about cage stage Calvinists, but they're some of the nastiest people on the other side too. And I think that they adopted that. To be fair to them, they adopted that because they got tired of the Calvinist attitude and decided, well, if you're going to sling it, I can sling it back. But shoot, because I don't accept eternal security, there's people in Leighton's group that think I'm going to hell.
Yeah.
And so, there's nasty people on both sides.
Slam RN says, I was a Calvinist for 18 months after watching The Dividing Line for 2 years. Then I came across Soteriology 101 and watched that for 2 years. The antidote, the real antidote.
Yeah.
Okay. Wait a minute. Nathan is here.
Oh, yeah.
Nathan, I met last week. I was in Tampa this past weekend. Spoke 9 times in basically 2 days. It started on a Friday night, and did a 2.5-hour Q&A. And Nathan was there. I would have put a picture of you up, Nathan. But yeah, and then I sat on the tarmac for an hour and a half trying to get out of Tampa because I was thinking I was going to be stuck there for a while. But I made it home. But I want you to know there was like several Trinity Radio people that showed up at the church in Tampa for that apologetics conference who don't go to that church. They just found out that I was going to be there. That really mattered to me. And I want you to know that means a lot to me.
Naomi had a super chat.
Yeah, there is. And then I wanted to get some other questions.
Thank you so much, Naomi. She says, where should we start when trying to explain our position to a Calvinist who sees Scripture through such a different lens? My pastor wants to discuss soon, and I'm not sure where to start. Leighton, you've had this conversation 1,000 times.
Yeah, and it really does depend on the Calvinist, because as I say thousands of times, even though I'm accused of misrepresenting Calvinism, Calvinism is not a monolithic group, and there are different kinds of Calvinists. So if I'm talking to Greg Kokel, for example, who believes in libertarian free will, I'm going to approach that discussion much differently than I'm talking to James White, who doesn't believe in libertarian free will and who's more of a compatibilist type. So there's different kinds of Calvinists. So it's really hard to give you kind of a one size fits all. For me, I usually start with the presupposition of the T. When the concept and idea that we're born unable to respond positively to the gospel is just assumed, I always push on that point and just say, where does the Bible teach that we can't respond positively to the gospel? Because I don't find it anywhere taught in the Bible. Now, there are some verses, of course, that Calvinists will often proof text or go to, but when you look at the context of them, they're not even talking about what the Calvinist seems to think they're talking about. There's no Bible verse, as far as I can tell, that because of the fall, we were all born unable to respond to God's remedy to that fall. It's just not there. It's that this is theological baggage that's been added to the scriptures, that even for whatever reason, even some Arminian type groups have adopted this concept and idea that we're all just born God haters. They're just going to always hate God no matter what. We're born guilty for what Adam did, and we're all, destined to hell because of Adam's sin, and we can't respond positively to the gospel unless we were picked before we were born and unilaterally changed into different people. Our very nature changed. Where is this in the Bible? Because that those concepts, as far as I can tell, aren't taught in Scripture. The way in which your Calvinist pastor is probably going to approach you is coming to Romans 9 or Ephesians 1, maybe John 6, maybe Acts 13:48 or something like that, and try to proof text you into Calvinism by showing you verses that on the surface may look like they're supporting the idea that God predestined certain people to become believers. But that's why I produced the program Soteriology 101, is that we go through those proof texts to demonstrate how the contexts don't support the Calvinistic conclusions.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that Manny has been very active in the chat, and I asked him, "Are you saying that we're not elect because of our position on the freedom of the will?" And he says, "No, you're not elect by your own confessions." Then Manny, this may not be the channel for you.
Yeah, this is not his first time here.
I've got absolutely no time for this sort of nonsense. One thing is true, that we both agree about the other one, that he needs to get right with God. So anyway.
Yeah, Manny's just one of those trolls he's why a lot of people have such an adverse reaction to Calvinists and not just Calvinism.
I'm sorry to the other Calvinists present that look is being pushed here.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Tim the Ancient. I find the implications of Calvinism gross and offensive to me, and there are Calvinists who see those implications as bugs, not features. The brutality is the draw. That's where my disdain comes from. So we have someone here who is openly saying, but he wouldn't say that they're unbelievers like Manny said, but he does say he disdains this. And it's, it's like, think about, I don't want to do that. People will get upset about the comparison. I'll just say this, that the reason that people disdain this, I think, is because it could be because of the way people act and all that sort of thing. I don't think so. I think the primary reason that people on our side, some of them may disdain this, is because of the implications that it seems to make about God. It seems to make this implication that God is in some way the source of what come to be evil things in the world. Right. That's why.
So
thank you for the super chat.
Yeah, thank you. I don't have the same level of disdain for Calvinism.
I'm the other Manny, and I enjoy your show.
I mean, I'm just like, it's whatever. It's interesting, I see how people have gotten there. I think they've gotten there through the wrong set of exegetical tools, but I don't have that kind of adverse reaction. But I do get why a lot of people do have that adverse reaction to, you mean God wants most people in hell and has decided to pass over, he's not even as good as Jesus told his followers to be with respect to the good spirit. It's like God expects more from us than he expects from himself, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I get that. I understand divine double standard, all of that stuff. But I get why other people have such an adverse reaction to it. But for me, it's my first reaction is not about Calvinism so much as it is Calvinists like Manny or these Twitter trolls that follow me around who still think it's like 2012. But as far as like Calvinism, they have nowhere to go now. I mean, because they can only blow wind outward, and they're going to start blowing wind towards each other now because they're just. That's why I use the language of implosion, because Calvinism as a cultural force in evangelicalism is imploding. And if you are a spectator for that kind of thing, you should follow it on Twitter or X or whatever it's called, because I know the philosophers are going to say correlation is not causation, but Leighton, see if you agree with me on this. My thesis is Trump destroyed internet or evangelical Calvinism. Donald Trump did. And let me explain why. The
Leighton's
candidacy,
doing an impression of Trump's mugshot.
yeah,
Right
it's a pretty good one. My thesis is the candidacy and presidency of Donald Trump destroyed evangelical Calvinism, because whatever you think of Trump, I don't care. The culture around Trump brought out a whole lot of social issues in the culture that all of these prominent evangelical leaders, most of whom were Calvinists, they were all on the same boards of Together for the Gospel Coalition, all of this. They started to have to pick different sides. You had the Russell Moore, Mark Deaver, more, social justice side of things. You had the Nashville Statement side of things. You had the Dallas and the Nashville, bunch of statements named after southern cities about we don't like all of this social justice stuff. You got the Voti Bachums on the other side of it. And when people started getting kicked off each other's Ligonier ministries, Together for the Gospel Coalition, which nobody reads anymore, seriously, it all coalesced around these issues that were brought out during Trump's presidency, whether it's the BLM stuff that you had mentioned, or,
Did you get this from somebody whose name is Q online somewhere?
No. What was the guy? What was the old president, the hipster, hipvinist president of the SBC?
Was it Greer?
Greer, and pronoun, hospitality, and all of this stuff.
I think you're doing him some favors calling him a hipster, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, he's older than I am, and I'm old. I'm really old.
When is this going to be done? Because I want to pray for somebody.
Yeah. Okay. But my thesis is when all of those issues came out and they kept taking sides, that started this implosion on the Calvinist side, as far as their big togetherness around the tulip became a bunch of different factions where Tom Askell and David Platt were on opposite sides of each other, fighting within the SBC, and yet the Russell Moore types and all of that. Is that pretty much, do you think that thesis is fair from your observations?
Yeah, Trump did bring to a head a lot of issues that the church is having to grapple with, I think, because of just his bombastic approach to everything. And yeah, Trump changed the entire political landscape. And of course, that's always, anything that changes the entire political landscape is going to affect Christian culture and church culture. And I'm no fan of Trump because of more of just his personality and his, moral, stances on views and things like that. The fact that he was able to appoint, very conservative judges, I'm very appreciative for, and I'm glad for that. But his bombastic approach to things, I think, brings so much controversy where controversy is not really needed. And a lot of people like that. People don't have to guess where he stands about things, that he just says it. And so that's kind of why Trump, I think, has become so popular, is that he's so anti-political correctness that it really attracts a lot of people, because they're so tired of the political correctness. But the fact that he introduced or brought into the mainstream so many of these issues, and all these other things that just happened within the culture of the world, I think, just the development.
Yeah, during those
how
4
the church
years
responds to that. Yeah. People had to respond to that. And
sorry,
Calvinists have the Calvinistic debate that was so big prior to Trump, kind of drowned it out by all of this other stuff, the Black Lives Matter movement, the woke issues that came as a result of a lot of those things that happened in the political world. And so the Calvinism argument among Southern Baptists was, drowned it out pretty quickly.
Yeah. Now you've got Ronnie Rogers, who's been on your show. He's written a lot of books against Calvinism, and Tom Askell lining up as, on the same side of the more conservative Baptist wing of the SBC versus the influence that Russell Moore and Mark Deaver and all of them have had, and David Platt and all that. And it's been interesting to watch that when they said, well, we can all rally around this, and then all of a sudden what divides them is much stronger than what united them around soteriology, because they are after each other. They do not, they don't even consider Russell Moore, who is a Calvinist, by the way, they don't even consider him a Christian at this point.
Who?
Russell Moore. A lot of these Calvinists don't. And
okay,
then,
wait. You're where we want to get to. So pause right there. And I wanted to say, I had this up a minute ago. Here's a Trinity student. By the way, you can be a student at Trinity at trinitysem.edu, trinitysem.edu, and it's all online. And Ryan says, I'm about to head to a local, Masid, I don't know how to say that Islamic word, to talk with my Muslim friends. Prayers are appreciated. May they be brought to faith in the Lord Jesus. So what we're going to do is, right now, whether you're a Calvinist or not a Calvinist, we're going to pray. And if you're an atheist, just sit there and consider whether Christianity is true for a second. All right. So let's pray. Father, thank you so much for Ryan. I thank you that you've given him an opportunity to do evangelistic apologetics in a real life scenario. I pray that you would work through him. I pray that you would give him the words to say smoothly and easily and let them come. Lord, I pray that that you would prepare the heart of this person, open their heart, soften their heart. I pray that circumstances would be right, that the persuasion would be there, and I pray that he responds to the Holy Spirit as the gospel is preached, he being the person or persons that are going to be evangelized. We thank you in advance because we know your word will not return void. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
All right, let's get on to another question here. Leighton, let's see. Nathan, and by the way, right here is, look here. This is Nathan. Where did he go? There's Nathan and me. You can't really see us that well because of the picture. But there's me and Nathan at the conference. Nathan. Anyway, he says, Leighton, how do most Calvinists you meet explain the first instance of evil, whether Satan or man? Where did that first desire to sin come from? Can you try to steal man, such a position?
Yeah. Well, I don't usually bring this particular topic up when I first meet a Calvinist, so I wouldn't be able to talk about that. But I can talk about a broadcast I did several years ago where John Piper actually addresses that very question on his Ask John podcast. They ask him, where did that first sin come from? Why did Satan fall? And I play that broadcast, and that would be an interesting one to listen to, because I don't know how to better steelman your opponent than let one of the leading Calvinistic voices out there speak for himself. And it's interesting the way he talks about it, because he speculates. He says he doesn't know why Satan would have sinned the first time, or just like he doesn't really know why Adam and Eve would have chosen to sin the very first time. That's a mystery that he appeals to. And he says, maybe it's something, and I'm trying to paraphrase what I remember from what Piper's answer was. Maybe it's something of God separating himself, or he distanced himself, or I think he uses the term cloaked himself from Lucifer, so that Lucifer would, go his own way, or something of that nature. In other words, separate himself from him, which is what called autonomy. It's funny how Calvinists will rail on us about, you believe in the autonomy of the autonomy of the sinner. And exactly, yes, when a person sins, they're acting autonomously. They're not acting in accordance with what God has decreed or caused them to do. They are acting autonomously. And I thought it was interesting that Piper actually uses the speculation of God separating himself from Satan and from Adam and Eve, leaving them to their own devices, as separation is autonomy. You're leaving them to their autonomous free will. And so this is the whole pushback that I have with Calvinists, is because a lot of times Calvinists will rail on us because we appeal to the mystery of human free will, but then they just kick the can down the road and they appeal to the mystery of the first decision of sin as what libertarian free will as a choice of an autonomous creature acting separately from his maker.
Yeah, and R.C. Sproul answered the question very similarly. He says, "I don't know, and I've never met anyone who does." As far as why did Adam sin? Why was it the first sin? That's what R.C. Sproul said.
Kevin C., thank you for that super chat, says, even though I find the Calvinistic view of God's character abhorrent, they are absolutely my brothers and sisters in Christ. Good day and God bless. Thank you for that. And similarly, Derek Beeler says, for Leighton, we argue against Calvinism a lot, but you and I both love our Calvinist brothers and consider them allies for the Great Commission. Amen. Amen. All right. Listen, we got talk about the woke thing for a minute, Jonathan.
Well, it's not just that. It's moved on. That's still going on with the Calvinists.
Wait, let me get this real quick.
Yeah.
Was Jesus a Calvinist? No. Go on.
But now, I mean, you've got even like within the Oldvinists, the old school Calvinists.
Oldvinists.
You've got
Richie,
like
you
the
won't
Owen
do.
Strachan beefing with the Christian nationalists, like what was that Stephen Wolf guy? So you've got like the Oldvinists are now dividing amongst themselves over Christian nationalism. Like people think that we were mean to Christian nationalists a couple weeks ago. I mean, these G3 Calvinists are going after them now. And so even within like the right wing, the conservative Calvinists, now they're splitting and arguing all over Twitter about the Christian nationalism issue. And so it's weird to find myself kind of in agreement with Owen Strachan, who I agree with on almost nothing except for the importance of physical fitness. But I find myself in his corner on the Christian nationalism thing too. But I think a lot of in the Southern Baptist Convention, Al Mohler and them were speaking out against a resolution that was somewhat crafted by some of his professors at the time on critical race theory. I think it was called Resolution 9 or something. And that was a big stink. And a lot of people were blaming Al Mohler because he had originally platformed a lot of these Calvinists at his seminary. And it was interesting because I saw on Twitter, like if you were to say what is the most woke SBC seminary, it'd have to be Southeastern, I think. And yet I saw on Twitter now, Mark Deaver was begging people to show up to this thing to sign up or they were going to have to cancel a 9 Marks event. I mean, imagine a 9 Marks event not selling out in the first week 5 years ago, 6 years ago. You know, and that they can't even attract a crowd at Southeastern of all places. So there's been just a lot of the political stuff, whether it's the more social justice or woke stuff, or even, you know, what people would see compromising on egalitarianism, or they would see compromising on the LGBTQ stuff with this Greer's pronoun hospitality business, and now Christian nationalism. It's like Calvinism has been splintered into this. What was once this we're together for the gospel is now shattered all over the internet fighting. That's just been my perception of things.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of opinions with the nationalism. I don't, just because I haven't studied a lot about the different views. Even the woke stuff confuses me on some level. But there's a part of me that thinks, you know, having been friends with, you know, people like Ronnie Rogers, who I know is a part of the CBN, which is the Conservative Baptist Network, who's really, you know, standing against the whole kind of woke crowd. And they have Calvinists in that group as well as non-Calvinists like Ronnie. And Ronnie seems like a very reasonable, level-headed kind of Christian that I could get along with just fine. And I love him and seems like a good guy. Every time I've talked to him, he seems real reasonable. But, you know, I've never met Russell Moore, for example. I'm just throwing out somebody that I know that there are
I stood
oftentimes
behind him in
coming
line
after.
for coffee once, and we talked about the weather for a half second. He seemed nice enough.
Yeah, or somebody like him. I don't know if he's the perfect example, but someone who's been accused, maybe a David Platt or someone like that, who's been accused of. I know Chandler has been accused of being woke, and I do know Chandler.
Why? Wait a minute. Why has David Platt been accused of being woke?
He likes black people.
I like black. What the heck is that about?
No, serious.
You're saying it's unfair.
For some, yes. Okay. For some of these things, okay. So there's a spectrum of this. Like,
you broke.
How do you do it, Braxton? How do you do it? How do you keep a straight face with this guy around?
Yeah,
No,
just
listen,
it's just
listen,
one of those
no,
things.
seriously. What this is the
Yeah.
point I was going to make. I was saying if you had a Ronnie Rogers and a David Platt or a Russell Moore, or somebody sitting in the same room together, and you were just talking on this, I would imagine that for the most part, there may be some differences, but for the most part, they would be pretty reasonable with each other and having discussions over stuff. But what happens in our, soundbite world of online internet combatants, combatants and trolls, you get people who do like they do to me sometimes in the whole Calvinism thing. They'll take little snippets of something somebody says, and someone like a David Platt or a Russell Moore, somebody will say something that's appeasing towards this particular liberal group over there in some way. Maybe trying to offer an olive branch, so to speak, to say, we do need to consider this about what they're saying. We do need to think about what these people are bringing towards the church and the accusations they're bringing. Whereas this group over here, as they see any form of appeasement whatsoever, even just the slightest olive branch, as, oh, now you're woke. And really, the person that was saying that doesn't believe that at all. What they're trying to do is make a bigger point about, offering the olive branch to say, okay, here's a valid aspect of what they're saying, but I may disagree with some of these other aspects. And so that I think that's the important part here, is that usually most of these kinds of online disagreements, if you had a face-to-face meeting with these people in the same room, most of it would be ironed out in a couple of minutes, I would think, because most of them are reasonable, level-headed, kind Christian brothers and sisters who would probably get along if they were just talking to each other in person versus the sound bites on the internet.
I don't know, man. Like I said, ever since the last two SBC conventions, I think the way people talk to each other on Twitter now is how they're going to talk to in person, and it won't be long before people get punched in the face for it. Because
yeah, you're probably right. There's probably some elephant in the room type discussions as they used to have those elephant in the rooms that would be pretty bad.
Now, I want to give
18% say that you guys were never Calvinists. That's 18% of the Trinity Radio audience. We'll take 5% off of that for people that were just joking, but that's still that's still a lot of people. Real quick,
and it really doesn't matter to me if they think that.
Apologetics. Really, hey, Dr. Flowers, question. When we use the term, quote, Calvinist, we are usually talking about soteriological issues. But also, isn't there a ton of issues we'd agree upon, like 75% of the Westminster Confession of Faith?
Maybe not so much on that.
Yeah.
It depends on your view of the sacraments with the Westminster Confession. Maybe the plagiarized
Baptist Confession.
Yeah. The copycat version of it, where they changed the sacraments to ordinances. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. I agree with, more with the Presbyterian than the Reformed Baptist.
Let's present a new type of Calvinist, perhaps. The Gavin Ortlund Calvinist. Now, Gavin Ortlund has been very important in the apologetics world, within Christianity, in having friendly, loving, but forceful discussions about Catholicism. And that's the context in which I'm familiar with Gavin. I don't know much about his Calvinism. Do you guys or want to comment on that?
I like the guy, but I don't have much.
He's Team Jesus. I'm on his team.
Yeah, he seems like a really great guy. From what I met him at one of the conferences. I think I responded to one of his videos a long while back. Seems like a real level-headed guy, much like what I said about Joe Thorne. Not that he's the same, same views of Joe Thorne on everything, but seems like the kind of guy I would get along really well with, and seems like a level-headed, nice kind of a Calvinist, kind of maybe like I said, Kokel kind of a Calvinist, Greg Kokel kind of Calvinist is the way he kind of comes across to me. But I don't know enough about him to be able to say much.
Yeah. Now, Aaron says, pushing critical race theory in your church isn't a joke. It's unbiblical and is much more than just Platt likes black people. That's obviously not the issue. Is that what this is about? Did Platt support BLM? Is that?
Well, I mean, Platt hung out with, this is one of those things. This is where it gets complicated. When we say woke, there's two ways. Woke has an original meaning of having a raised awareness about racial injustice. And if that's the definition, we want to go by the classical definition, then I'm woke and I'm happy to be. But also woke has been used to describe everything from CRT to a bunch of white, lesbian, blue-haired professors who are talking about like genderqueer and all of that stuff. So woke has become a term that has been used now, and that's not the right's fault, by the way. That's back to the lesbo blue hair college professors. They all try to out woke each other with the most ridiculous progressive view. Now, much of what's progressive has been called woke. I don't know that David Platt is pushing critical race theory, or that he could even articulate it, for that matter. But we have a tendency that anytime anyone wants to talk about any sort of racial issue in America, people on the right, and I'm sorry, you don't get much further to the right than me, but people to my right want to say that's critical race theory when they have no idea what they're talking about, because they've never read a single book or a single article written by a lawyer talking about critical race theory in a journal, much less the popular level what is critical race theory book. And so calling everything when someone speaks out about racial injustice, oh, that's CRT. Half of me wants to say, well, I mean, even Kimberly Crenshaw opened that door when she said this is a fount from which all this other stuff is sprung, and like anti-racism and all that stuff. I think CRT is absolute epistemological trash. It's godless nonsense. It's the whitest thing ever. By the way, if you look at its, post-structuralism influence, liberalism influence, postmodern influence, feminist hermeneutic, like all of that, Marxism. Yeah, it's the whitest Eurotrash nonsense ever, repackaged into racial issues by a bunch of lawyers who probably would be no better than a C average philosophy major undergrad, to be honest with you, when they write this stuff. It's garbage. Completely agree. But there's a tendency that if you speak out on racial injustice, they're going to say you believe in CRT and you believe in anti-racism and all of that nonsense as a way to shut down the conversation. And I'm not going to play that game either. And so I don't know that David Platt could even define CRT, but I do know that some of his detractors will accuse him of being a critical race theorist just for mentioning some racial injustices here and there. And I think that I'm going to have to side with David Platt because I've never heard him assert anything CRT.
If you read David Platt's book, what was it? It's the one that's yellow. Somebody who what's that?
It's called I think it's called Radical.
No, not Radical. Not Radical. There was one more recently, just from like 3 or 4 years ago. But it basically talked about all the counterculture, I think is what it's called. Anyway, you read that and you try to tell me that David Platt is woke. That just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Now, Russell Moore, I agree with you. Russell Moore, someone says we're not going to put the word on the screen. Yes, I'm not a Russell Moore fan. I think he's an absolute trash human being, along with David French. I will put that out there. I say that every other day on Twitter. What? So I'm not a fan of Russell Moore or David French.
He has intrinsic value. Yeah. He's not trash. But Christoph, thanks again. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, if we're going to get canceled, it might as well just jump all the way in, right? As an old white guy, as I've become now, getting in my older years with the white hair, and what I have learned, kind of going through all of this, the BLM, woke, CRT, all the stuff going on, which I don't pay a lot of attention to be honest with you. I just kind of got away from the talking heads because of what it was doing to my soul. But what I do know of it and what I've seen of it, in my own walk with the Lord,
thanks,
and trying to balance these differences and these views, there's I think points being made by both sides, which is usually the case. There's usually some value from both perspectives and both sides, that if people would be reasonable enough to kind of to sit down at a table and talk through these things, they can probably find some value from both perspectives. And I know the feeling like I'm automatically considered a racist because I'm a white guy. I hate that. And that's one of the things that makes us white guys so angry, is when you just assume that we're racist because we're white.
Yeah, that's anti-racist nonsense. That's that white fragility nonsense. That's all.
Well, on that view, I read White Fragility, and on that view, we're all racist. We're benefiting from a system that is intrinsically.
Yeah, I mean, all that Ibram Kendi, White Fragility, whatever, Robin DiAngelo, all that's absolute garbage. And so I don't that's why it's so dangerous. We had that super chat. It's so easy to throw woke around, and I do it too as much as anybody. And I think a lot of what goes under the banner of woke now is trash. Classical definition of woke, I agree with. I want to fight racial injustice wherever it is. I don't think it's under every nook and cranny, just like a Pentecostal thinks there's a demon in every broken transmission in your car. I'm not that kind of person, but where it exists, I want to fight it. But so many people go overboard in both directions with this, that it's those of us who sit kind of.
Well, that's what I was getting to, is that, I think the vitriol reaction that most of us white guys have towards, all these things are called reparations. How are we going to pay back the people who had to suffer in slavery the last years? How many times do we have to apologize for our past mistakes that we didn't even have anything to do with? It was our great grandparents or whatever else. And how many times we're going to keep bringing this up, and how we're going to make this about, and those kinds of reactions that we as white people tend to have to all of this stuff that keeps being brought up. That there's the one side, and I get it, because I feel the same way, and I felt the same way until I sit down and have a discussion with somebody from the other side of the aisle and hear them out, not the radical weirdos that are the trolls on the internet, but the one who has thought about these things seriously and have good rational arguments. And when I sit down and I hear what they're saying about how their parents or their grandparents and the influence of their lives upon their lives and the problems that they have had to deal with because of the systemic issues, and I hear them out and I go, oh, I've never even thought of that before as a white guy. That's never even crossed my mind before until I sat down with you and talk with that. Now, me just saying that right now on your show, somebody can grab that as a soundbite and go, oh, Leighton's woke. Look what Leighton said, because Leighton said something nice about somebody who disagrees with him on the other side of the aisle and gets where he's coming from. That automatically makes you quote unquote woke. When what it really is saying, at least I can see somebody else's perspective and understand why they feel the way they feel and where they're coming from for the reason they're arguing the view they're arguing for. Doesn't mean that I'm quote unquote woke in the negative sense. It means that I'm reasonable. It means that I'm willing to sit down and at least hear somebody out and understand, oh, now I get where you're coming from. Just like we do in the whole Calvinism, Arminianism, provisionism debate.
Yeah.
To be able to see somebody from their viewpoint and say, oh, as a Calvinist, I understand where you're coming from. I understand why you believe that.
Yeah, a lot of the non-Calvinists kind of stay out of the online fights about the CRT and all of that. But the Calvinists, they have no problem planting their flags on these various issues of the more Republican or conservative, which like I said, I'm pretty far right wing. I've made no secret about that ever. I'm a conservative guy. I'm not a Republican. They're trash too. Not as trash. I mean, the only thing worse than a Republican is a Democrat. And Democrat.
You're not a Republican?
No, I lean anarchist, but I mean, like, I think that the Democrat Party is absolutely.
Did you feel like the chat needed more fuel?
Yeah.
Is that what?
Yeah. The Democrat Party is the absolute worst political party in 2023. If you could still if you call yourself a Christian and can still vote for a Democrat, you need to check your sanctification, because, I mean, they're awful. But yeah, do you go to the Republicans then? No, they're pretty awful too. I mean, we got a Senate minority leader that can barely hang on to a podium and not freeze up. But anyway, so enough about my political opinions. Become an anarchist. As far as Calvinists go,
is there still anything left to say?
Well, so I want to say woke Christian nationalism. I think Nick brought that up. That's something I came up with to make everyone mad. Because if you say you're a Christian nationalist, you're going to make woke people mad. If you say you're woke, you're going to make the Christian nationalists mad. So I decided to call myself a woke Christian nationalist.
So we need to have that. Leighton, do you have anything you want to say to kind of round all this up and tie it in a nice little bow? What has God determined for you to say at the end of the show?
Labels, whether you're talking about Calvinism, provisionism, can be abused. Pelagianism, we've all talked about how these labels are abused. The same thing happens with conservative, liberal, progressive. The same things happen with the Black Lives Matter, the CRT, the woke. All these labels become their own little entity based upon what your experience is and what your label. Even using, somebody mentioned the word systemic. Even if you use the word systemic, automatically that puts you in that category, because that category uses that terminology all the time of systemic racism and these kinds of things. But if you acknowledge that there are systemic issues, and you acknowledge what people, because of those systemic issues, have felt, then that automatically, in some people's mind, puts you into that category, when that's not necessarily the category you believe or you're standing in. You're just acknowledging their position and why someone may believe the way they do, and you're understanding them. Again, there's a big difference between agreeing with somebody. It's like what we've said before. You need to be able to say, I understand, before you say, I disagree. Saying that I understand your position is not the same thing as saying I necessarily agree with your position, or I think that we should be paying reparations, paying money to groups of people because of the quote unquote systemic issues. But I can still say I understand why somebody makes an argument for that. I understand why they feel that way. There's a big difference between those two views. And some people can't, because they're not willing to think at a deeper level, they can't even acknowledge the difference between I understand and I agree. If you even say, I understand where you're coming from, and you offer the olive branch of saying, I get where you're coming from, I understand why you believe that, and still disagree with maybe what you think is the answer to whatever that problem may be, just being able to help somebody to feel understood is seen as quote unquote, coming over to the other side, and you're giving them too much weight, and you're supporting their views and all these kinds of things. And really what you're trying to do is to make them feel heard, make them feel understood, because that's what most people are looking for. They're looking to feel understood. They're looking to feel that they've been heard. And some people don't even want to give them that, because giving them that is somehow coming over to their side, or supporting their views, or their positions. And that's where I think some of this comes down to, where it gets really, really messy and very combative, is when people aren't willing to at least have the table talk discussions, and to say, I hear you, I understand where you're coming from, and then begin to talk about what are the best actual practical solutions to these kinds of problems.
Pritchett, Leighton, when you said just now, when you tried to say the words reparations, were you struggling not to say reprobations? Because that's what it sounded like. That's where it was going.
That's exactly, because I'm so used to talking theology.
Reprobations.
I don't talk politics. It's exactly what was going through my brain.
What you just said, I think our Calvinist friends on the internet, they need to take your advice, because we've seen Calvinism unite around Tulip, be a big force in evangelicalism, and all of that's gone. And part of it's because of that cage stage attitude, how they lash out at other differences. But I think part of it goes back to something Al Mohler once said. Before you tweet, pick up a phone. Because a lot of these Calvinists, I am not a schadenfreude guy, like I said. Your mileage may vary. I don't like to see this. Go back to arguing with Leighton, because, he needs more views. Right? But wasn't it better, when we were all fighting each other over Calvinism, than watching Calvinism destroy itself by all of these different factions just sniping it? I don't think that's good for the kingdom to see that much division within one stream of Christianity in America. And like I said, Twitter is real life. These people are taking it off of Twitter. And so, Calvinists, I want you to listen to what Dr. Flowers just said. Go play it back and adopt that attitude. Go sit down at tables and get it together, because we need Calvinists to, get back to the main thing, which is, not destroy churches that aren't Calvinists, but build up new churches and impact the culture for Christ. And Leighton, you're probably smart to stay out of politics. I would be smart if I did the same, which I'm not that smart as you. But I don't like to see I don't like to see Calvinists destroying themselves. on the internet. So maybe they need to take your advice and all get together at one of their get-togethers and come back together for Calvinism, if not the gospel, because you get the gospel wrong. But Calvinism's not in a good place right now. And listen to 3 non-Calvinists talk about what's wrong with Calvinism. You need an outsider perspective because you're a mess and you can't see it. So
I could make a joke about that.
Yeah.
But anyway,
and by the way,
RN says, wow, this is almost a record for a Friday show, 1.5 hours. Well, it's because we got Leighton on here.
We could go
also,
for
it's
3
because
hours.
there's 3 of us. And as you add new theology geeks, you have to increase by 30 minutes. So,
but let's call it done because I'm ready.
Yeah, well, I tried to wrap it up a minute ago
Okay.
by asking Leighton if he had any final thoughts. Do you have any other final thoughts, Leighton?
I could, I can just keep on rattling on and keep this going for another, hour and a half if you want. But I think we said what needs to be said. And when people are reasonable people and hearing with a fair mindedness about themselves, usually that goes a long way to helping people, not automatically assume the worst about the person they're listening to because you happen to disagree with them theologically. And that happens way too often, where if Tom Nettles, a Calvinist, says something that you disagree with, the non-Calvinists are going to come down a lot harder on him than if a Billy Graham or Adrian Rogers would have said the exact same thing. Just because they happen to agree with you theologically, you tend to view people on the other side of the theological aisle with more strict and angry tone in their words, and instead of, I think, being what we need to be is to be brothers and sisters and to kind of say, yeah, he's kind of like my weird uncle in Thanksgiving, he means well, even though he's saying really goofy, dumb things, sometimes, and kind of look it over and kind of look past it and kind of, choose to get along even when you disagree with somebody. It doesn't mean, and I'm not trying to say you become namby-pamby and you don't give your opinion or you don't hold to strong views. I think you can do that, but you can do so while still being respectful. David Allen just put out a tweet that I thought was really good and retweeted it. And he says, I have an idea. How about we try to disagree without being disrespectful? And it just something that simple, I think can help us go a long way, where you can disagree with people without totally shattering their personhood or, trying to get them canceled as they say in these days. But
you don't ever treat me
that discussion.
way, Leighton.
Well, you're like my weird uncle at Thanksgiving. I mean, that's just the kind of way of...
He's somebody's weird uncle.
Yeah.
All right, folks, this has been awesome. Leighton, it's always such an honor to have you on. You're a very prominent voice out there, and we appreciate you and learn from you. And you've personally helped us in many ways, and we look forward to seeing you very soon in a couple of weeks in Texas.
The great state of Texas.
Yes.
And it is a great state. It's great.
I am looking forward to Texas barbecue.
It's great.
And California Caveman, you have me confused with IP, who is the wishy-washy libertarian that Michael Knowles talks about. Libertarians want to get elected to government. I don't think there should be one. That's the difference between me and libertarians.
If you do go to Texas, just know there is no basement to the Alamo. Let those who know understand. You guys know what that's about?
I've been to the Alamo.
Do you know about the no basement in the Alamo thing, Leighton?
No.
Does anybody know? We'll leave it to the people. A very well-known celebrity died recently and named Paul Rubin, and it has something to do with a film he was once in.
Oh.
So go figure that out. And with that, we'll see you all next time on Trinity Radio.